some of us have a long way to drive back to our destinations afterwards. We can't run too much overtime. Garth didn't give me any notes. I think a lot of you know him, but his primary training is in statistics, but he has a very wide range of interests and does vast amounts of reading and is knowledgeable on numerous subjects. I'm particularly interested in this subject today, so I'm not going to cut his time. He's going to get his full hour.
Oh, do you do that for others?
You go to your full hour, Trevor. I'm not going to cut him on behalf of Andrew's overtime. And the other thing about him that some of you may not know is he had a very cute little baby girl of 2 at home who spends a lot of her days with him as he works from home, interrupting his work. Okay. Thanks, Garth.
I'm not showing anything on the screen. Trevor told me at the start of this weekend that Fed talks don't do very well on PowerPoint. So I thought I'd just put it in here as notes to myself. Basically, I'm talking about reason. How rational can we be? What are the obstacles in the way? Is it possible that are there any rational people around, that sort of thing? So I'm going to cover a lot of cognitive biases and some other sort of can be quite technical stuff on rationality and decision theory and that sort of thing. Okay, what is reason? Wikipedia reckons things like consciously try to make sense of things, discursive as opposed to intuitive thinking, applying logic, establishing and verifying facts. I sort of made my own definition, like believing that one should justify your beliefs, ideas and actions, appealing to evidence. That sort of definition is related to the ability to change and then therefore to freedom and self-determination. So there's some sort of link, philosophically at least, between reason and liberty and freedom. There's another way of looking at reason, this is instrumental reasoning, which is accuracy. Like unbiased expectations, your errors are random. This is what economists mean by, economists and decision theories mean by rationality. Is that if you make errors, the errors are random, but your expectation is unbiased. So Francis has done a couple of talks over here as well about that our conscious mind doesn't really run the ship. We have a lot of shortcut heuristics that we use unconsciously. But why do they exist? Why do we have these biases? One of the reasons is we simply we don't remotely have the capacity all the time to think rationally, deliberately through everything, every little thing that happens to you. Just we need something that's much quicker and dirty. People are generally bad at estimating probabilities of events. These heuristics are shortcuts that work well enough most of the time. They evolved to deal efficiently with hunter-gatherer problems, but in the modern world they often lead to systematic biases. Okay, this is a short intro. Now I'm going to go through some cognitive biases. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many of them that were discovered by Kahneman, Tversky, and other theorists. First one I'm going to touch on something called the availability bias. This is when you judge the frequency or probability of an event by the ease with which examples come to mind. A strong influence is your estimate of risk. One research showed that the coverage of death in newspapers and which causes of death people think are most frequent or most probable, there's a correlation of over 0.85. So what you think, when you think about the cause of something, or how frequent it is, how quickly it comes to mind, is very influenced by what you see in the newspapers, just what is covered. So, we overestimate the likelihood of whatever comes most easily to mind. For example, stuff that you've seen more often, what's covered in the newspaper. What's more vivid, it's, shocking or more vivid, gives you a nice, clearer picture, more emotionally driven picture. And also stuff that doesn't require a lot of mental effort. So simple stuff comes to mind more easily, and you think it's much more common than it really is. For example, people think accidents are more common than diseases. Not even remotely close. They think homicide is more common than diabetes. Also not remotely close. On the other side of it, we vastly underestimate what we haven't experienced. We see the largest event in our experience as a kind of an upper bound. So, for example, floods. We look at our recent history, what has been the highest flood we've experienced. We tend to think that's the highest possible. We underestimate the probability that it could go higher. In fact, they do go higher quite often. I don't know how many of you know of a writer called Nassim Taleb, Black Swan, Food by Randomness. Well, black swans are a form of what we call a fat tail problem, which means that most of the variance in a process is accounted for by exceptionally rare but exceptionally huge events. So, say very rare floods or very strong earthquakes, for example. Most of the damage, the variation in damage, is caused by those, and not by the very frequent little tremors or a little more rain than usual. We consider these events as far less likely than is actually the case. For example, long-term capital management, when it had its collapse, they said they were hit by a 10 sigma event. That's 1 in several trillion. Now obviously things like that happen to them happen far more often than that. And it's very difficult to motivate people to take steps to prevent these fat tail or black swan events. They simply don't see them, it just doesn't happen to them. They don't think it's their plan. And then all they can see is the cost involved in this. And it's kind of difficult to justify, if nothing happens. Is it because of the steps you took, or is it because nothing was going to happen anyway? So, very difficult to justify. Typically what happens is people take steps to reduce the risk they've experienced so far. So if they've had lots of small floods, they will build levees and dams that deal with what they typically experience. And then what happens, they get a false sense of security, they take less other precautions, less insurance, that sort of thing, and then they suffer from really big floods. And in fact it's been found that because of the huge damage caused by these big floods, the building of these levees and so on has resulted to higher damage overall per annum than without. So it's good to build levees, but you should build in a lot of fail-safe. And we're just not made to, it's one of our systematic biases. We don't we underestimate the possibility of these really big rare events, things that aren't available to us, the availability heuristic. Another one that's quite important is something called hindsight bias. This is when you think you've seen some event happening and you think it's much more, it was very predictable and we should have seen it, like Pearl Harbor, should have seen it coming, 9/11, that sort of thing. But it's been found, of course, before the event, they're not very predictable at all. We just think they are and we blame people. That's what we call hindsight bias. It's actually quite an important factor in deciding negligence cases, in legal cases. For example, one study showed that something to do with the bridge and flooding. They said how they decided not to put a guard on the bridge to see if something would get caught and cause some flooding. And without telling people what the outcome was, they say, would this decision not to put a guard there, was that negligent or not? About 76% said, no, it's not negligent, there's no reason to put such a guard there. But when the sample of people told that in fact a flood occurred, some blockage flood occurred, then people said yes, 57% say yeah, there was definitely negligence involved, they should have been able to foresee it. It also influences, when heroic acts come off. We tend to say, well, the hero must have foreseen what was going to happen and he did what was necessary, instead of just taking some huge risk that could have had a massive downside. Knowing the outcome came out okay, we think it's okay for people to take heroic risks like that. It's probably useful to try and persuade people don't do that sort of thing. Some examples of hindsight bias. Pearl Harbor, long-term capital management, etc. When we systematically underestimate the surprises that the past held and holds, we subject the hypotheses and rules we use to interpret and anticipate the world around us to very weak tests, and therefore we find very little reason to change them. That was one good reason to try and avoid hindsight bias. Unfortunately, as with most of these biases, most of the intervention measures tried out are totally ineffective. You tell people avoid hindsight bias, explain what it is, they have very little effect. Another common important bias is what we call conjunction fallacy or representative heuristic. This is when you regard a subset as more likely than the whole set. A famous example where you say some lady went to university, she was big on social justice issues, she studied philosophy, and then we're told she works as a banker, or she works as a banker who's active in the feminist movement. Now people are far more likely to see the second one as a more likely event, except that it's a subset of just being a banker. Being a banker, being non-feminist or feminist, is much more likely than being a banker with feminist interests. The reason why we do this is that we have this heuristic that looks at plausibility as a kind of stand-in for probability. So we think that this person who studied philosophy and had social justice issues is much more plausible that she's a banker with feminist interests than that she's just a banker. And we mistake that for probability. Now, Conjunction event is where we have an intersection. So that means it's got to be that and that. We tend to overestimate those, and we underestimate the frequency of disjunctive events with this or that. So for example, if you have 7 events, all of them have a 90% probability, but all 7 of them have to come true. We tend to think that's much more probable than if any one event, each of them with 10% probability, whether it's generally the other way around. And often lawyers' summations make this mistake. They usually avoid disjunctive arguments and focus on the conjunctive arguments, even though the disjunctive argument is generally more predictive. In security fields, for example, say US security, we focus, this bias leads people to focus more on specific issues, like specific risks, like bombs and shoes and board cutters and things like that, instead of a system that can deal with any sort of problem or risk. So, in other words, we think the event with a lot more detail in. The conjunctive event is far more likely than it is, and we focus on that. And that we end up neglecting what we call the disjunctive stuff. This could happen, all that could happen, and then have a system that is flexible enough to deal with all of that. We underinvest in those things. Next one is, I think everyone knows this one, something called confirmation bias. Okay, here I'm going to give you a little puzzle here. I have a rule in mind. The following sequence of numbers is an example of the rule: 2, 4, and 6. Can you guess my rule? You may test your guess as often as you wish until you're satisfied with it. You want to try, give me 3 numbers that you think satisfy. If you want to test it, or just tell me what the rule is.
4, 6, 8.
Yes?
1, 2, 3.
Yes?
What do you mean by yes?
It is true.
Eh?
12, 24, 36.
Yes.
1, 7 and a million.
Yes.
These are numbers.
3
no,
numbers
that's not my rule.
of which each is larger than the previous number.
Okay. But none of you did what you were supposed to. All of you have the confirmation bias. Everyone gave me an example of something that they think fit the rule. They never sort of tried to look for an example that disconfirmed it.
I tried to, but I was right.
But anyway,
You thought you were wrong and you were right.
it's typically what people do is that you look for stuff that confirms your hypothesis. You have a hypothesis, you say, okay, so it doesn't confirm it. You can come up with an infinite number of examples. But you say, okay, this is my hypothesis. What would disconfirm it? Let me try that out. Very rare. That sort of Popperian kind of thing, very rare. In fact, 80% of university students got this one wrong, even though they had as much time as they like to test this. Anyway, the definition of confirmation bias is looking for evidence that confirms your hypothesis rather than evidence that challenges it. Now this is a cold example. It's neutral. There's no emotion involved in it. Add strong emotions to this picture, for or against the hypothesis, and you increase the bias manyfold, and also you'll increase the resistance to change. Now, if believing a hypothesis becomes desirable, then your perception of the actual support for that hypothesis increases. So if you want to believe it, you tend to see more evidence for. It leads to motivated reasoning, or another way to put this is rationalization is activated. We tend to unfavored evidence and conclusions are held to higher standards than favored conclusions. Unfavored stuff suffers motivated skepticism and disconfirmation bias. I'll talk about that now. We ask, for example, of stuff that seems to challenge our belief. Does it compel me to change my mind? The favored view just gets asked, does it allow my conclusion? Vastly different standards on this. The social scientists have looked at the effects, a number of interesting effects of confirmation bias. One thing they call the prior attitude effect. If you feel strongly about something prior to seeking evidence, you will evaluate supported evidence more favorably than unsupported evidence. There's disconfirmation bias. You will spend more time and effort denigrating contrary arguments and facts than you will support it. Attitude polarization, this I find quite interesting. You expose subjects to a balanced set of pro and con arguments. Exposing them that will exaggerate their initial differences. It will not bring them together. And more evidence will not bring them close together. So if one bit of evidence didn't work, bringing more evidence in won't. Interesting thing, Andrew might have known about this, is they look at knowledge, scientific knowledge. You would think they'd get the more science knowledge they would have, the closer they would come on questions, say, like climate change. And in fact, they find that more knowledgeable subjects are more polarized. And it's not just climate, but it's been shown in all sorts of other fields as well, from maths to psychology. Then there's attitude strength effect. Subjects with strong attitudes will be more prone to the above biases. And this is a particularly important one for anyone who might be interested in reasoning. It's called the sophistication effect. This is when someone is politically knowledgeable or knows something, is more prone to these biases because they possess more ammunition to counter incongruent facts and arguments. In other words, knowing about all this bias stuff might actually make you a worse thinker if you're not careful. One should apply your knowledge even-handedly, at least if truth is important to you. Because one of the things that I've realized over time is that people seldom, the purpose of thinking is seldom to find the truth. It's mostly to rationalize something you already hold, or to signal that you belong to some group.
I think so.
There's another one. This might apply to a number of these biases called the backfire effect. Contrary evidence strengthens your initial convictions. You find that cognitive dissonance results in some brain changes, building new memories and neural connections that strengthen your original convictions. So, when you go gung-ho and try to prove some other guy fell wrong, you'll probably strengthen his view. Like creation science, for example. You could show them as much evolutionary stuff as you like, you're probably going to just strengthen their view, and vice versa. It also plays into conspiracy theories, because you show them evidence. The conspiracy theorist tends to think, well, this is part of the conspiracy and the effort to cover up. So it just confirms their belief.
So who's paying you?
Another one a lot of you may have heard of is anchoring. Anchoring is exposure to some arbitrary number that biases one's expectations in that direction. One study they did, they spun a wheel, a roulette wheel. They came up with two arbitrary numbers. One said one said 60 something, the other said 30 or 13. And after that, well, two groups, one saw one number and one saw the other number. And obviously this is completely random, it doesn't have anything to do with the question. And they asked them, how many African countries are in the UN? And those who were shown 60 something on the roulette wheel gave roughly about twice the number of those who saw 13. Now, just exposure to something completely random, you might not even be aware of it. And even when you know it's got nothing to do with it, it still influences your estimate of thing, how common something is. So even if they're hugely implausible in size, it still works. And it works because people have difficulty just estimating the number. What they do is they start with this number they've seen, and then they make adjustments in what they think is a correct direction, until you come to some point, the first point when you think, okay, this is starting to be plausible, and then you stop. That's often a problem. People think to the point where they think they've got an answer, and then they stop thinking. And this also has an effect when you ask people to fit confidence intervals. They get an estimate, and then they say 90% confidence interval. They move it this way, and then to the point where they think it's plausible in that way. But really, they stop far too early, and it should be much wider. That bias is a specific form. A more general form is something called contamination, where any arbitrary information will work its way into your cognitive judgment. Like fiction. You read fiction, and you know it's fiction, you know it's a story, it's all made up, but still people treat things like, say, The Terminator as a documentary on AI or something. We should make a deliberate effort to undo an unbelief fiction. It's difficult to do. I think one of the only ways you do is not to say, well, I won't believe in that, but expose yourself to the contrary side. So there's two beliefs cancelled. And these things can be remarkably persistent. It might be something you saw many decades ago. As I say, a children's story or fictional story. You have no idea what's influencing you later on when you have a certain attitude to a new technology or something like that. So, as I say, we should make an effort to correct it, but nevertheless we found that real world problems, rewarding people, instructions to avoid these biases, do not reduce these effects at all. And what's more, people insist that they have not been influenced in any way. It's more easy to persuade, well, the other guys might have been. No, I wasn't. Even when you show them that they have it, it takes quite a while to convince people that they are subject to these people, and they never really take it on the board. And being cognitively busy, other stuff in your mind, or one-time pressure, will increase the size of these effects too. Next one is something called an affect heuristic. This is when you think something's good or bad in some sort of global sense. And then you use this global judgment to reach judgments on the probability of something else. For example, we ask people, what would you spend to save, say, 150 lives? And then they ask, what would you spend to save some percentage, a high percentage of 150 lives? All the way down to 87, if this works. People are willing to spend more money to save 87% of 150 lives than in saving 150, all of the 150 lives. Because 87% sounds good, it's nice, a precise number. It's just a global good. Whereas 150 lives, you don't really know that that's a lot or not, it's like vague. Unfamiliar stocks to analysts. They tend to think if it's risky, it must have low returns. Risky is bad, low returns are bad. When they're all familiar with it, they know, they sort of stick to the truth, where risky is generally associated with higher returns. But as I say, when thinking under uncertainty, we use these global judgments of good or bad to make judgments about other aspects of the problem. There's another one we call scope neglect. This is where we treat large numbers as little different from small numbers. For example, you ask people, how much money are you willing to donate to save a particular bird, or maybe 100 birds, 1,000,000 birds. The actual amount of money people are willing to donate to these things doesn't scale up to these numbers at all. There's very little change. The same thing with people. And, for example, the value of a number of human lives goes up as the log of the number, not linearly. Our brains simply aren't capable of multiplying the horror you might feel at one death by 1,000,000. You just can't feel 1,000,000 times that degree of horror. On the other side of things like joy. Another explanation is what they call the good cause dump. People are willing to spend a certain amount of money on a good cause. What they're focusing on is the good cause, not the numbers involved under that. So that's what they devote to a good cause. I'm not interested in any other things. It's the related thing is where you purchase moral satisfaction. You pay for the warm fuzzy. It has little to do with the problem itself, but more to do with your own psychology. This one's fun. Calibration and overconfidence. How many nuclear bombs do you think have been detonated on Earth to date? I want you to try make a 90% confidence interval. A lower rate, an upper rate. Just try, don't tell me I'm going to ask you to raise hands to see if the various values are within. Okay. Is 500, raise hands who's got 500 in their range.
Wait, are you saying it's as many as or less than?
I asked you to get a range, a minimum and a maximum that would encompass 90% confidence interval for you. You're 90% confident the numbers within those ranges.
Within that range, yes. Okay.
Is 500 in that range for you?
Okay, gotcha.
Okay. 1,000? 2,000? 2,200? Well, the actual figure is 2,153. And we got, I think, 2 out of how many? I should have got 90% of you, if we were calibrating correctly.
You just get a feeling, I actually thought there were more. So I was on that side. So where do the ranges lie?
No. Was that number within your range?
No.
So you're saying the minimum was higher?
Yes.
Then were you still wrong? Calibrated bad, just mostly you're on a different side from what.
Yeah, but are you saying, I just want to get a feeling here, that most of the people think that it was...
Most people think it's less, I think.
Yeah.
I was very shocked it was that much. But
Who's, just out of curiosity, who decided not to participate because you had no confidence in your answer?
No, he didn't suggest the number anywhere close to what I thought it was.
I haven't a clue. I didn't participate. But no idea.
okay. It's still fair to say that it was the people who got it right were nowhere near 90% of this group. People are accurate about setting odds up to about 5 to 1. But when you get to like 100 to 1, it's say 73% all right. So instead of one making one mistake out of 101 cases, 27% are wrong. So it's 20. That's a 27-fold difference. Over 27-fold degree of overconfidence. 1,000 to 1, only 81% get it right, but that's level of confidence. And 1,000,000 to 1, 90% get it right. So that's 24, 190 and 100,000 times as confident as they should be, respectively, in those. So when people are extremely confident, they say a very low probability of being wrong, they're generally extremely overconfident. Events assigned a probability of 2% happen 42 or 43% of the time. That's 21 times as much as they should be, if you were right. And what's more, people are prone to setting high odds. People set odds of things like 50 to 1 more than half the time, 100 to 1 about a quarter of the time. So extreme overconfidence is a major problem. As a matter of research, I just gave you one problem. Generally, when they test these things, they give you 20 problems to set these limits on, like Galileo's birth and things like that. And I didn't do well on that test. So I'm not just sort of teasing you guys. I'm wondering. Experts are also very bad at calibration, even in their own fields, and when that field isn't all particularly fuzzy, maybe something like engineering, and of course political science and economics is probably the worst. It's just saying experts are not immune to it. There's something else called the planning fallacy. People say, how long is this going to take? This is a calibration issue as well. People generally regard their best case scenario as the most likely scenario. And what actually turns out is what they think of as the most likely scenario. What actually happens tends to turn out worse than their worst case scenario. There have been other things like
optimism bias.
People say it takes 10 times as long as people say it will, or cost is the other side. It costs much more than that.
So the Medupi guys just made it a little better, yeah.
Oh, you can see they're usually stats on projects of a similar thing. If you look up those, they're generally much more reliable. But you get, as I say, the engineer calculates something, a lot of detail, but it turns out to be his best case scenario, not he regards that as his most likely scenario. Yes, I was saying other rules. People say if you say it takes a day, you go up in one sort of time level. So if you say it will take a day, it will take a week. If you say it will take a week, it will take a month will take a year. That's one rule of thumb. Others say just multiply by 10. Generally,
Everything will be
people
done
are
by
very good
Friday.
at calculating. And I'll say, you should realize that both your own thoughts and those of experts have much less force than you think. You should realize that in order to, if you take that to heart, maybe it will take less to change your mind. And it might speed up your reaction to evidence. But I'm not all that confident. 90% or otherwise. This one is also often covered in psychology, something called bystander apathy, where you introduce extra people into the situation will actually reduce the chance that anyone will respond as needed. Like when somebody's been murdered or a heart attack or there's smoke coming out of the door. If you're on your own, you might go and do something. But Just a couple of people in, they kind of all look at each other. And if no one's doing anything, then no one does it. It's either a diffusion of responsibility where everyone hopes someone else will step up to plate, or something called pluralistic ignorance, where when you see lots of other people not acting, they kind of sit then you say, okay, well maybe it's not serious. You said maybe the situation is more ambiguous than I thought, and you start worrying about it. That's one of the reasons why people don't act on things they all agree on. I'll get to another bias later. And it will relate to your Cape Party thing. This one I quite like. Who's heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? This is another one. It says the unsophisticated, ignorant, competent, or just plain stupid don't have the ability to know they are unsophisticated, ignorant, incompetent, or stupid. They tend to think they're just as knowledgeable and clued up as everyone else. I'm not going to go any further into that. I think the problems with that are obvious, and I don't know if there's much of a cure for that. Okay. Just to summarize, I say, well, the sophistication effect. Don't use the knowledge of these cognitive biases to dismiss people, or as a substitute for tackling real facts and arguments. I mean, you can. It's fun. You can have fun trying to accuse other people of bias. But if you're actually serious about true things, I'm saying make an effort to avoid it, even though the evidence shows that asking people to do that sort of thing doesn't have any effect. I'm asking anyway. Some other interesting studies are professional ethicists. By this I mean professional philosophers who specialize in ethics, and clerics of various religions. It's been found that they're not more moral than other people. You would think that all that thinking about morality would have some influence in their behavior, but it appears not. One effect it does have is they tend to espouse stronger ethical standards and to have a somewhat dim view of everyone else's behavior. It doesn't actually change their own behavior. And this has been checked out in quite a wide variety of behaviors, right from calling your mom, not kicking the dog, to organ donation, to not joining the Nazi party. We found that there's no difference between these professional ethicists and everyone else. When asked what the excuse was, one philosopher said it was, well, they don't think it's fair or worthwhile to be held to these high standards. They're paid to think about morality, but to actually suffer through all these high standards is above their paid grade. Not much like the rest of us. They don't want to suffer for goodness while the rest of us benefit from vice. Maybe we should be grateful. After all, those who offer themselves up as models of wisdom are frequently wrong about them being wise. A related thing is professional philosophers exhibit substantial framing and order effects. I don't cover those biases, but other biases, and are just as subject to them as non-philosopher academics. Some of the problems used, the trolley problem, I don't know if you're familiar with the trolley problem. There are various versions of it. If you've got like a trolley going there, and there's someone on that line. Well, there are a lot of people on that line, and you have the power to divert it onto a line with a single person. Is it ethical to do so? Should you do it? Or is it okay to do it? Then there are various versions. Instead of diverting onto another track, you push a fat person in front of the trolley. Or if someone is in hospital, you've got all these people needing organs. organ transplant and you have one healthy patient that somehow matches all of them, is it okay to do it in, take it all, and save everyone else's lives? I found that, okay, depending on how you frame it, has significant effects on how these philosophers respond and in what order you put these problems in also. And even though true, you should have a similar answer no matter how it's framed or what order you put these things in. Forcing them to delay their answer so that they think about it, encourage them to consider different variants of the problem, or different ways of describing the case doesn't influence the effect at all. This is even more amazing, is that being familiar with the problem to the point of saying yourself that you're an expert in that problem and having prior opinions on the problem did not lower the effects either. So cognitive biases persist in spite of training, expertise and reflection. A little thing, some of you may have seen a recent political bias test. But basically they look at, they give you a list of facts that come from various positions. They support various positions along the political spectrum. And you're politically biased to the extent that you're less accurate about facts that support your views, support views you dislike, than facts supporting views you do like. I did the test and it showed that there was a difference. I did have some difference, but nevertheless they said I was in the top 2% of the unbiased. So most of us are susceptible to this. Another one, I mentioned something about thinking is not necessarily about truth. Another one, politics is not necessarily about, it is not about policy or the welfare of any group. It is about which faction will rise and fall in status. So it's not so much the PC is we're concerned about the welfare of the poor. It's just about should we respect them. Okay, this is a really technical one, and I think I would like to write something on the board.
Board behind you.
Okay, but who can see this one?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, you can try it. We'll move our heads.
Right high.
Should we move the podium? Close your screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
20 minutes after your hour.
How many fish?
Oh, then, how many sentences
Many of you know Bayes' theorem? Who doesn't know Bayes' theorem? This was a theorem developed by a certain Reverend Bayes. It has a profound effect on decision theory. As I say, a utility maximizer using constantly upgraded Bayesian numbers is the leading modern conception of what it means to be rational. Now, Bayes' theorem is, say, probability of B given A is equal to the probability of A given B. What's the probability of B over probability of A? You can expand this one to say perhaps that one plus A given not B times probability of not B again. That's just complicated. What it says is that you might have a prior probability, what they call a certain probability. You believe something with a certain probability. You think this is a case, say Keynesianism. Is Keynesianism correct? You go assign a low probability to it. This is the probability of that same one after you've been given evidence, some evidence A. So this is how this is the formula you should use to update your beliefs when you see evidence. Of course, this number can go up as well as down, down as well as up. So what it means is that what is the evidence giving your belief, if your belief is true? So what is the evidence of something happening, say, if you believe Keynesianism is rubbish, what is the probability of having low inflation if that's the case? And then, of course, is your prior belief that Keynesianism is rubbish. And this is the general probability of inflation under any circumstances. So that way, with this form, you can say, okay, you see, you've got your prior belief, Keynesianism is rubbish, and then you look at, has there been inflation? Not inflation. Use that as evidence, and you can use this number, and then you can upgrade your belief. If you have a very low prior probability, it will shift it up a little bit, but it won't make it high. So I'm saying both the evidence and your prior beliefs will influence your beliefs after the evidence. It's not just one or the other. To find that if you get a lot of evidence, no matter how low that is, this number comes quite high if the evidence is in favor of that, quite quickly. This is if you want to be rational, I think this is one would do well trying to master this one. It's not all that difficult if you practice a little bit. But basically, you could probably do it informally, where you sort of upgrade your beliefs. But this is a formal way to do it. It tells you how much you should, and it forces you to think more rigorously. I'm only covering this because it's mentioned in what comes. I came across a really fascinating study, science study. Is that when people simply have confirmation biases and that. There was this parapsychology. There was this one guy who was famous for showing that with double blind studies and everything, say if you stare at somebody, they become aware of it often, they pick it up. Even though there's no physical way to see they're being stared at, like there's a camera on them, and somebody's in a room staring at them, and then they're given a random schedule of when to stare and when not to stare, and they look at their reactions. And he was famous for showing that there was this effect. He showed it. He repeated studies with these randomized control studies. Then there was a skeptic who was equally famous for showing no effect whatsoever. And he repeated studies with randomized control. So they decided, okay, one of them must be doing something wrong. They actually got together for a study. They agreed on the protocol and everything, and they went through the study. And what happened is the parapsychologist found positive results, and the skeptic found zero results. So, even when you try to take very careful measures, you can still sometimes get this confirmation bias or disconfirmation bias. Somehow it works, even though we're not sure how it does. The interesting thing about this study is when where it was actually published, where both authors accused the other author of faking results.
So, which is true?
Not from the study. Okay, who's heard of Robert Aumann? He's a Nobel Prize winner in economics for game theory, and on this theorem I'm going to mention.
What's his name?
Robert Aumann. He's a very orthodox Jew. He's a cousin of Oliver Sacks. We met him, my wife and I. He took quite a shine to my wife. But I don't blame him for that.
No bias at all? No bias at all?
Robert Aumann proved that when people have identical priors, this sort of thing, and common knowledge. It is impossible for rational people to disagree. Common knowledge is basically, you know that I know what you know, that I know, and so on, so we both know the same things, and we both know that the other person knows it, and so forth, and we know that the other person knows that I know it. And the mere act of saying something publicly can change the world, even if what you say is obviously all. Because now everyone knows that everyone knows. Before then they think that they're alone. Dictators are often helped to stay in power by preventing such public statements. So if you come out with a poll showing that the majority want secession, or okay with secession, I think that there's a lot of potential for changing things. Nerds may struggle with social issues partly because they try to make everything common knowledge. When it's actually socially useful to try to maintain some plausible deniability. Because these social interactions, like come up and see my etchings. We know what that means. But you can sort of still pretend that you thought it was about drawings. Anyway, they say, why it's impossible to disagree. As each of you get more information, particularly what the other knows, it closes off part of your decision tree. This will take me ages to show, so just take probably 40 minutes afterwards if you want. You may think that the first person offers, say, hypothesis A1, the second one takes it into account, and then puts together a position and offers you B1 in return. The first person again takes that into account, changes position and offers A2 in return, and so on. And then so the rational pair gradually close in on an agreement. But that's not what should happen at all. It would not be a rational argument if it did happen that way. Your expectation of both your future position and your opponent's future position should be identical to your current position. You should not be able to predict how your position will change or how the other person's position will differ from your own. Because then these predictions will be already part of your current prediction, if you're able to. If you expect new information that will shift your position in a specific direction, you may as well shift your position in that direction right now. Rational arguments tend to follow an unbiased random walk until they terminate in some common knowledge and complete agreement. But we know that people don't end up in agreement in arguments. And why is that? Well, it could be that other than ourselves, of course, people aren't rational. They're not rational, they're morons or they're liars. So you can discount the views. But the point is, Ullmann's theorem is still aspirational, even if that's the case. If someone disagrees with you, you should treat it as the same as a contradiction in your own view. Another reason why people might not agree, they might not have identical priors. They might not start from the same position. But some mathematicians have shown that a Bayesian, somebody followed this, should regard everything that makes you different as simply different information. And then you get back to Ullmann's theorem, and there shouldn't be a disagreement. So having non-identical priors is not an excuse for not agreeing. Anyway, they say you can't privilege information just because it's in your head if others are as smart and as informed as you are. You could reject Bayesianism as a framework for rationality altogether. Or you could say real-world complexity overwhelms the reasoner's time and computational power. In other words, people are arguing simply don't have the time to communicate everything they know or everything needs to be known. But it's been found that the degree of disagreement doesn't depend on your knowledge, the extent of your knowledge. It depends on what you call the number of shared expectations. It's a very technical thing to say Well, random walks occur if, for example, you're looking at a probability between 0 and 1. The random walk is going to bang up against those limits. So the bounds in which where the random walk can go. Also say the variance of expectations is a very technical, strictly monotonically non-decreasing. So the variance is not going to decrease. So you're bouncing around in there. I say you're almost bound to hit the same spot at some point, and then you'll agree. So that sort of complexity is no excuse either. Maybe we're not well modeled by as Bayesian and Common Crowd, but Harmless theorem still gives you guidelines if you want to be rational. It basically boils down to try to see the other person's point of view. I'm going to skip something because I'm sure
Yeah,
you
you'll have to, your time's actually up.
I'm sorry, but this isn't important. Okay, I'll go through this quickly. Okay, these biases are ubiquitous everywhere. But it turns out when you do all these studies, while most people fall for the biases, there's always a small percentage who don't. And we find that in virtually every bias. There's significant individual variation in cognitive biases. Philip Tetlock did a study on forecasting, and he found that some people are much better than others. Prediction market traders differ in skill. But when you look at all these performance on these biases, you find there's a correlation between people who manage to avoid one bias are generally good at avoiding others. So there seems to be like a general factor of rationality or irrationality, if you want. Also say there are two group factors. One is conscious avoidance of intuitive but wrong answers, is generally associated with high IQ, and biases like Bayes rate, neglect, probability, belief bias, argument evaluation, expectation maximizing, overconfidence bias, and conjunction fallacies. That's one area and they're related to IQ. What's not related to IQ, and the difference of group factor, is consideration that you may actually be wrong. It's not associated with IQ, it is with avoiding my side bias, blind spot. I don't have any biases at all. Sunk cost fallacy and anchoring effects. But being one of these more rational people, as I'm saying, more rational people do exist. And they have some associated factors like being more patient, less impulsive. They're correlated with utilitarian thinking. They're less likely to believe paranormal. They're more actively open-minded, less dogmatic. They behave like an ideal economic actor, the Homo economist, and are more weird, if you know, the Western educated, individualist, rich democrat. Super forecasters regard their views as hypotheses to be tested and not treasures to be guarded. Other factors related, being more male, some academic disciplines like maths rather than history, but not the level of the education. No difference between undergraduate and PhD. Autistics tend to be overrepresented. And they also, people who are more rational tend to have other neurological differences, particularly frontal lobes, and not having excess dopamine. So I think I was going to say something about how you can become more rational. Actually, the answer is you can't do much about it. If you're not one of these people that are already one of these outliers, you can move a little bit, but not much. Kahneman, for example, said for all his research, he still couldn't avoid the biases. I think make truth your main value. Humility is a big one. Put yourself in other shoes. Favor challenging information. Look for critics. Don't make decisions quickly. Try to check your thinking for biases, even-handedly. But what seems to work is, at least with forecasters, is feedback. don't know how to become national because they never get tested more than once on the same problem and they forget about it. Anyway, that's finished.
Unfortunately, there's no time for questions. Yeah. Right, chat to Garth after you'll go.
I'm looking for Scott, he's got to get mine going. I don't think this always, just know that's yours. Mine. Is he not here?
Why do you need Scotch?
He has one, I think, on his computer. Oh, let's just move this back for you. What's happened to his computer? Does anyone